Hello, everyone. Good evening. And tonight I'm going to do a bit of a special stream. A couple of weeks ago, I did do an episode with some friends on the current Iran conflict, and I thought rather than just going over the news, I thought I'd do something a bit different. So, what I'm going to do is I want to try and ask a question on this stream, which is the other week, AA, because he's been covering on his office hours this conflict, and he wants to ask a question, why does the British regime or British establishment interested in kind of talking to Iran? Why do they, talk to various members of the regime on in the media and on TV? Unlike with Russia regarding the war in Ukraine, where we never hear from the Russians from our media whatsoever, and it's like a complete shutout. And one of the reasons for that is because I believe our regime ultimately, I think, wants to try and establish a good, functional relationship with Iran. And why do they want to do that? I largely think it's downstream of the history between Britain, Iran, and Russia, because obviously in the 19th century, you had the Great Game, which is this great sort of contest to a sea of influence in Central Asia between Britain and Russia, and I did a stream on that with Apostolic Majesty just over a year ago. And fundamentally, even though Britain is no longer a great power, I still feel this is the only way I can really explain why Britain is so hostile to Russia, but yet it wants to behave relatively cordially towards Iran. And I think it's because that as Iran is part of BRICS, they're an ally of Russia and China. I think Britain and to a larger extent Europe are wanting to try and break Iran away from Russia and China. And how they want to do it is they want to kind of go do it a bit more covert than the Americans, who just want to bomb Iran and for Israel. Britain and Europe want to negotiate. They want to try and normalize relations. And I think ultimately they want to try and remove the hardline regime that's in place under the mullahs. And I think the only way to do that is to treat Iran, as not as a pariah, as a normal country, normalize relations, drop all the sanctions. And one reason you could certainly say is to get access to their oil and fuel resources, and which is certainly helpful because, especially when it comes to Europe, the Europeans, even though Russia's right there, they've decided that no, they don't want to be reliant on Russian oil and gas. They'd rather to be dependent on Iranian oil and gas. So the book I'm going to be reading from is quite interesting. It's called The English Job, Understanding Iran by Jack Straw. And so for those who don't know, Jack Straw was the former British Foreign Secretary from 2001 to 2006 under Tony Blair. And so obviously interesting figure, is one of the architects of the Iraq War. But Jack Straw is interesting because he's obsessed with Iran. And so ever since during his time as foreign minister, he did a diplomatic visit to the country in, I think it was 2002 or 2003, and he was the first representative of the British government who visited Iran after the 1979 revolution. And so he's sort of coming in, engaging with them, trying to normalize relations, but also trying to sort of go, despite the change in the regime. Obviously, beforehand it was the relationship was with the Shah. Now we've got a regime that's a lot. Whoops, muted myself there. But ultimately, you now have a regime that is more hostile and very cognizant of the history between Britain and Iran. And in this book, Straw's just sort of trying to go over the history of that relationship and try and overcome a lot of what you could call our Iranian anxieties. I had a question in the chat from Rong Tao Wu. B, do you think that the Shah was paranoid and that Britain was trying to overthrow him? That is a good question. Personally, it's funny because there are people in Iran who actually believe Britain was behind the 1979 revolution, funnily enough. So if you believe those people, then yeah, that's correct. But personally, I don't think we were behind it. I just think that for whatever reason, Britain and America felt the Shah could no longer be relied upon, hence why they didn't prop him up in 79 like they did in 53. I'll need to look more into that, but just on a gut feeling, I don't really see why we would have supported the 79 revolution, considering what happened afterwards. and the rather hostile relationship Iran has had towards Britain, America, and the West as a whole. Got another question from Garrett Fisher. Keep up the good work, Bede. Looking forward to this listen. What's Iran's outlook on this business? Is today's Persians willing to deal with Foggy Albin as Keir Starmer's Britain seemingly is? What we'll get into as I read this book, but ultimately, I think Britain, since at least the Blair government, really being kickstarted by Jack Straw, has made more of an effort to try and have a kind of like a restart to the relationship that we used to have. And ultimately, there's all this baggage from the past of all the various screwings over Britain has done towards Iran. And so a lot of the obstacles is trying to convince Iran that, listen, we want to deal with you as equal partners who can mutually benefit from a relationship. We're not trying to fuck you over, basically. But as you can imagine, that's a bit of an uphill battle. So without further ado, let's start reading. Okay, so this is from Chapter 1. English is not the enemy. 22nd of October 2015. Cross the dual carriageway at that gap, Mohammed, our interpreter, shouted to the driver, taking instructions from his phone, and pull up behind that white car. In the dark, we, my wife and I, and 2 friends, saw 3 large men in plain clothes get out of the white car as we braked behind it. One, shorter, was better dressed than the other 2. He was wearing an immaculately pressed suit, buttoned-up shirt, no tie, and had an enamel insignia in his lapel, with the Iranian emblem on it. He was obviously in charge. He opened our driver's door and shouted at him in Persian. The blood visibly drained from the driver's face. He was bundled into the back of the unmarked white car. One of the other men got into our driver's seat. Mohammed, who had gone out to talk to the other officers, had to scramble back into the people carrier and was about to drive off. Our driver had quickly worked out who these men were and knew not to argue. I hoped that they were police officers of some kind and on our side. This was far from self-evident. 3 decades before, there had been a hard stop in North Tehran on a British diplomat. Edward Chaplin driving with his wife and young child, with Edward bundled, handcuffed and hooded into another car and driven off. I decided not to share this information with the rest of our party. They were already fearing that this was a kidnap. We sped along the Shiraz Ring Road again. We'd been round and round this road system which circles the great city at least 3 times already and were now very familiar with it. Close to the Botanic Gardens, we abruptly turned into a dimly lit side street to pull up behind another people carrier. Identical in make and model to ours, the only differences were that this one had different plates and smoked glass windows. We were told to be very quick, to transfer all our luggage and ourselves into the new vehicle. A third officer joined us in the back seats, this one carrying an unconcealed pistol. Off we drove again at high speed for yet another scenic tour of Shiraz's Ring Road. As we approached one roundabout, a uniformed police motorcyclist with a plainclothes pillion passenger carrying a large submachine gun that looked like a Heckler & Koch MP5 drew alongside and had a conversation with the senior official. We finally arrived not at our booked hotel, but a brash 5-star Shiraz hotel, which commands a high position on the Mount Northern Hills, overlooking the city. We were put into rooms at the end of the 9th floor, told to lock them and open them to no one. It was then that we learnt that the well-dressed man was an official of the Fars province, and that the others were police officers of varying ranks. By now, I was assuming that these officers were indeed on our side, and that we were not under house arrest, but could I be certain? As for my emotions, I was doing my best not to have any, though in truth I was in a great muddle about them. I'd had 24-hour police protection throughout my 13 years in cabinet, and I kept telling myself that these men were not that different from the British police officers who had kept me safe. On the other hand, I knew enough about Iran and its competing organs of government to know that it could be dangerous and unpredictable. I also felt a strong sense of responsibility for the anxiety that had so plainly been caused to the other members of the party. It was I who had prompted the trip and organised it. Later, we were let out of our rooms for dinner. In the hotel restaurant, the lugubrious owner of the hotel, who spoke perfect American English, introduced himself and told us how happy he was to have us as unexpected guests. On the way back to our rooms, we were told to stay in them until instructed otherwise. We noticed that the complement of police officers had meanwhile grown to 8. This was day 7 of our Iranian holiday. We, well, my wife, Alice, and me, with 2 close friends, Julia and Dan, whom we had known for almost 40 years. Alice, Julia, and Dan had heard me rabbit on about my interest in Iran over many years. A Foreign Office diplomat who had served in Tehran had commented to me, "Once you've got the Iran bug, there's no known cure." I had the bug. I'd always visited Iran 6 times before, but only ever to Tehran and always in an official capacity. I devoured every volume I could about Iran. I wanted to see and learn more. So did Alice and our friends. Once I'd retired from the House of Commons in May 2015, I had the time and space to make a holiday in Iran. Our first mistake was to decide to visit in the last 2 weeks of October. This suited us, and the weather was likely to be tolerable across the country. But as we discovered after fixing our dates, this was the period of Muharram, the sacred month in the Shiite calendar. This commemorates the assassination, martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, at the Battle of Karbala in what is now southern Iraq on the 10th of October 680 AD, cementing the growing schism that had disrupted early Islam from the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, and which continues to this day. The morning is very public. Men everywhere were dressed in black clothing with black flags, marching in processions with some flagellating themselves. It made for such a stark contrast with us, despite our respectful clothing, including Alice and Julia in headscarves. And no doubt the disparity heightens the suspicions that some, though by no means all Iranians, have of outsiders. And so just to kind of comment on the bit I've just read, this whole bit about them having to have this security and being bungled out into another car and into a different hotel, what he's alluding to is, well, obviously you've got all these different institutions in Iran. You've kind of got like an institutional rivalry. So you've got the regular sort of, domestic police, security and government officials trying to keep him safe as a foreign visitor. Whereas at the same time, you've got, groups like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij, who are really, anti-foreigner and quite nationalistic, not liking that this, former government minister is visiting the country. What's he here for? Is he trying to spy on us or steal secrets or plot a coup or something? The climax of Muharram is the 10th day, Ashura, the great feast of mourning, remembrance, and atonement, which most emphatically sets the Shia apart from the Sunni, according to the Iranian-American scholar Vali Nasser. In retrospect, I should have guessed that we might face difficulties once in Iran, given the problems we had encountered in having our promised visas issued. Normal diplomatic relations between Iran and UK had been suspended in November 2011 when the British embassy in Tehran had been invaded and sacked by hooligans, and intelligence officers, almost certainly under the direct control of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and its powerful Shadri militia, the Basij, which counts some millions amongst its volunteers. The IRGC had been established soon after the 1979 revolution by the newly installed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini as a counterweight against the regular armed forces, about whose loyalty he was very suspicious. The Basij was established in November 1980. Originally independent, it came under the IRGC in 1981. By the 1990s, the IRGC, with the Basij, had become the strongest organ of all within the Iranian security apparatus, and so its position remains. The IRGC had established itself as a political force in its own right, with a closely associated political party and media outlets. Major General Qasim Soleimani, the commander of its Quds force, responsible for its non-conventional warfare and extraterritorial operations, is by far the best-known military leader in Iran. It is he, working directly to the Supreme Leader and not the elected government, who had been in the lead on Iran's military and foreign policy in its neighbourhood. The IRGC has extensive business networks under its control. Most of its leaders have been strongly opposed to President Rouhani's nuclear negotiations, partly for ideological reasons, but not least because it has done so well from the supervision of busting smuggling. Once reformist President Rouhani had taken office in the summer of 2013, relations between Iran and the United Kingdom began gradually to be restored. The British Embassy was partially reopened in 2014, but the then UK Home Secretary, Theresa May, had been reluctant to allow the provision of a full visa service, on the mistaken belief that a supposed bargaining chip would somehow pressure Iran into agreeing to the easier readmission of failed asylum seekers and other illegal immigrants who had been detained in the UK. Thus, at this time, any Iranian national wanting a visa to visit the UK had to go to Istanbul or Abu Dhabi, and any UK national wanting an Iranian visa had to go to an Iranian embassy abroad. I got to know the new Iranian Shah, the diplomat in charge of the embassy, Hassan Habibollah-Zadeh. I liked him. He knew from experience that he could trust me. I talked to him about the idea of our holiday some 8 months in advance. He had assured me that there would be no problems in my securing visas for my party. I later received our completed application forms himself. Weeks went past with me regularly checking on progress. Inshallah, Arabic for if God wills it, was usually the reply. So, Mr. Habibollah-Zadeh, is that inshallah yes or inshallah no? I asked him. I was met with a nervous chuckle and a promise that it should be all right. I was initially told that I'd be able to collect our visas from Iran's Oman embassy. When I happened to be there at the end of September, I took all 4 passports with me, but was told the visas were not ready. We were due to fly out to Iran on Friday the 16th of October 2015. At the beginning of that week, Mr. Habibulahzadeh said that the relevant permissions had now been granted, but there was still no precision whatever about these permissions might be translated into visas in our passports. I called Mr. Habibulahzadeh and told him politely that I was going to turn up at his embassy on Wednesday the 14th of October and would not be leaving until I'd written confirmation of the visas. After I'd sat around in the embassy for 2 hours, one of the staff finally came in with an email from Tehran with the magic serial numbers for our visas. I then had to book the Eurostar to Brussels for the following day, since the London embassy could not formally issue me with the visas. I was accompanied on that trip by a young, bright British Iranian, Kazra Arabi, who had been working for me part-time in the Commons on Iran, who spoke fluent Persian and who had helped me greatly with this book. The Iranian ambassador to Belgium and the EU received me royally, and the visas were quickly pasted into our passports. Yeah, just had some more questions in the chat. So, while not straightforwardly about this reading, the IRGC has often been bandied about as the hardline side of Iran. I'm wondering, has the IRGC been waxing in strength right now? I'd argue they're stronger than ever because I mean the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the former supreme leader Ali Khamenei, is pretty much a puppet of the IRGC, from what I understand. And with this war going on, this has only emboldened the hard and more nationalist sides of the Iranian regime. So I think the IRGC are at probably the strongest they've been in recent years. The only way I could see them falling is if there's like a total just collapse of the system. But I only see that happening is if, I don't know, like America literally launches a full-on ground invasion or just bombards the country with nukes or something. Also, what is the relationship between the government and the IRGC right now, in other words? It's complicated because there's so many different government bodies. One thing you have to understand is the Iranian government is very much underpinned by this concept that's been around since the constitutional revolution in the early 20th century, the concept of mashruta, or guidance, which is the idea that things such as, democracy, republicanism, or parliamentary governments, all of these things are fine and not, haram, so long as they are guided by Islamic principles. And so they have this sort of what you might call an institutional parallelism, where for every kind of quote secular part of the system, there's got to be an Islamic counterpart. So with the president, you then have the supreme leader. With the obviously Majuls, the parliament, you then have the assembly of experts and other such institutions. With the army, the Artesh, you then have the IRGC. It goes on and on. This is constant, Islamic shadow institutions behind everything, and it's because they believe that without these institutions being there, these quote more secular institutions may stray from the correct path, so to speak. The holiday began like any other sightseeing trip. Hang on, I've missed a bit. Okay. Before I left the embassy in London, I had asked Mr. Habibulahzadeh why there had been such a delay in granting our visas. There had first, he said, been a problem with an invitation I'd accepted to attend and speak at an official conference run in Tehran by a think tank directly attached to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On the day before our holiday was due to begin, despite the fact that this invitation had only been made to me because they knew I'd be in Iran anyway, and despite the fact that it had come from an Iranian government institution, some others had said that I'd be compromising the terms of my tourist visa, so I'd abandoned the conference. Someone else had complained that I'd not been very helpful in 2003 over the nuclear dossier. A bit rum since Sorry about that. My internet cut out. Right, can you all hear me? Yeah, I hope it's not like that bloody assassin stream I did about 6 months ago, because that was annoying. StreamYard's kicked me out about 3 times in the space of like 2 hours. Oh, you just as I was thinking, wrong Taowu. Okay, right. Looks like people can hear me, so I'll carry on. Okay. Let me find where. Yeah, I was just talking about Bush Jr.'s administration being somewhat a mixed blessing. Okay. Then Mr. Habib Zadeh dropped into the conversation that an Iranian deputy foreign minister was due to visit London the following week for official meetings, and he was furious that the British government was requiring him to go to Istanbul to collect his visa. I didn't blame this deputy foreign minister who's angry about his treatment by Theresa May's Home Office. I'd oppose Mrs. May's policy, as they well knew. However, the Iranians are always reciprocal. Yeah, so because the British government was messing about the Iranian government officials, the Iranian government are like, well, fine, we'll mess about your officials or formal officials anyway. Having acquired the visas, we had to travel on Turkish Airlines via Istanbul because British Airways had suspended their direct almost daily flights to Iran when our embassy had been invaded in November 2011. We arrived in Tehran in the small hours of the following morning, where we were met by our tour guide and interpreter. Mohammed, not his real name, had been recommended to us by Kazra's auntie, who had been senior in a large semi-state Tehran travel agency. He proved to be one of the best tourist guides and interpreters there was. As events transpired, we were more grateful than we could ever have imagined for this recommendation. Once we had obtained our visas, the other practical problem faced was money. US banking restrictions mean that international credit cards do not work in Iran. We had to stuff our pockets with thousands of US dollars and pounds sterling to cover the whole trip. Changing money in Iran was simplicity itself. There were scores of exchange kiosks in every large city who operated with remarkably little paperwork or delay. The holiday began like any other sightseeing trip. There's plenty to see in Tehran, though it's been the country's capital only since 1786. Tehran is known to its residents as the City of Paradox. Surprises are everywhere, none better than the Museum of Contemporary Art. With its contemporary concrete spiral design, the building's rather like the Guggenheim in New York City. The museum was established by 1977 by Empress Farah Pahlavi, wife of the last Shah, with an astonishing collection of modern art from around the world. The most risque is stored, but a lot is on display. During the more puritanical periods of the Islamic Republic, most of the contents had been put in storage. I asked one of the curators why the museum had not been closed altogether. We just carried on, he said, and tried to keep out of sight, but how no one could have noticed the 2 large Henry Moore sculptures displayed on public view in the museum's garden, in full view from one of Tehran's major thoroughfares, remains a mystery. As we left the museum, Mohammed said to me, "Never forget, Jack, Iran is the end of the West." Iran's singular sense of itself, its pride in its 3 millennia of history, and its resentment that its European heritage is not appreciated beyond its borders are themes with which one is constantly assailed across this intriguing country. Yeah, very true. They're very proud of their civilizational history, and they kind of feel that the rest of the world doesn't give them enough respect, which is understandable. I interrupted our tourist program for one piece of official business to pay a call on my old friend, Dr. Kamal Karazi, who was Foreign Minister of Iran for 4 of the 5 years that I served as British Foreign Secretary. Kamal had continued to exert some influence on Iran's foreign policy as President of the Strategic Council on Foreign Relations. And, more significantly, as an advisor to Khomeini's successor, the present Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Kamal was a great representative for his country, tough and single-minded. On one famous occasion when I had complained, "Kamal, you have no idea how difficult it is to do business with the government of Iran," he had shot straight back in his fluent English, "But you, Jack, have no idea how difficult it is to do business within the government of Iran." Touché. Yes, no truer words were ever spoken. That repose speaks volumes for the complexity of Iran's governments within governments, as we were to discover in Technicolor on this trip. One small surprise was the penetration of social media. If you ever think that the British are obsessed with their mobile phones, try Iran. There seem to be more phone shops than in any other scores of other countries I visited. The iPhone 6 had got to Iran 6 months before it got to the UK, the full force of sanctions notwithstanding. When I'd asked a very senior Iranian diplomat shortly before our trip whether the upcoming elections to the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, might lead to disturbances and repression, as had happened in 2009, he replied, "Very unlikely. 10 million iPhone 6s have now been purchased in Iran, though events in 2020 would show that his optimism was misplaced." The much larger surprise, however, was how almost everyone knew who I was. My recognition rate, not just on the streets of Tehran, but in provincial centres, was almost as high as it was in my Blackburn parliamentary constituency, which I'd served for 36 years. Jack E. Straw would go the cry, pointing with the inevitable request for a selfie. It should be noted, the reason they say Jack E. Straw is because Iranians have a trouble pronouncing words that end with the consonants, such as S and T, and so without putting an E in front of them. So straw, they can't say it, they have to say Jack E. Straw. And you'll see that a lot. You may have noticed it when I've been reading segments from the Modern Iran book. A lot of words have like an E sound on the end, and that's for that. It's for that reason. Julia decided to start a selfie account, which reached 30 in a few days. On day 3, Mohammed showed me a blog with a picture taken from a car of our group walking towards the Museum of Contemporary Art. The caption was not flattering, but I took no more notice of it. The second stage of our journey was by train. From Tehran station to Yazd, the isolated desert city in the centre of the country, whilst we waited for our train in a secure area between 2 control points, a bearded, thick-set man in his 30s engaged me in conversation. He was, he said, studying for a PhD in ethics in the holy city of Qum. A 2-hour commute every day. Was it true, he asked, that money controlled everything in America? And why did the UK and Germany always agree with the US? As I did my best to explain, we were joined by others. An old man asked if I thought Tehran was safe, and did I like it? Yes to both, I replied. I'd be happy to see my daughter walk around the city. Should come to no harm. It was interesting, he talks about, why does UK and Germany always go along with America? Well, remember, this was October 2015. It's fast forward 11 years, and things are very different now, and are certainly going to keep deteriorating. Oh, what's this from Wrong Tail Woo? I've heard that inflation is bad enough that phones are twice the pre-COVID era. Interesting, that wouldn't surprise me. The train journey turned into a public meeting complete with selfies. One man asked about setting up a youth parliament. Another told me that the forthcoming Majlis elections would result in no change. He was going to see his family during Muharram, but he was not religious. For those who were, the train stopped at Muhammadiyah, Qum, for 20 minutes to allow passengers to get off and pray. About 2/3 did so. Yazd proved to be delightful and well-ordered, with a strong sense of civic society. Its isolation had meant that it had avoided much of the conflict that had raged across this part of Asia for centuries, enabling it to continue as a Zoroastrian stronghold. Its temple has had a fire burning continuously in it since 470 AD. It has the most exquisite and functioning white wind towers, known in Persian as Badger, wind catchers, which act naturally as air conditioners, and a remarkable system of kanats, underground water channels for irrigation. Interesting, he says it's missed much of the conflict, but if I recall correctly, I remember Yazd, I think, was actually besieged by the Afghans in the campaign leading up to the fall of the Safavids, and I'm pretty sure Nader Shah sacked it as well. So maybe it's not had much trouble since the Qajars have come in, but it's certainly not been entirely peaceful. One night, as families were gathering for communal eating and entertainment as part of Muharram, we went off to a Zurkhane, a special circular gym pit, when ritual martial arts with huge weights are practiced by all generations. It's a tradition which reaches back to Iran's Zoroastrian roots. Big, strong men have long played an influential part in street politics in Iran. After 3 nights in Yazd, still unsuspecting as to what lay in store, we set off by people carrier to the southern city of Shiraz, about 100 miles from Yazd, in the middle of nowhere. We had a scheduled stop to visit the cypress of Arbukir, a venerated tree estimated to be between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, which myth has it was planted by Japheth, son of Noah. Close to the tree was a group of young men in their 20s, all in Muharram black, neatly dressed with trim beards, waiting for me. They presented me with a document formally tied with green ribbon. It had 2 A4 pages in Persian, personally addressed and explaining why I was not welcome in Iran. Mohammed, our guide, gave me a quick translation. The full text, see appendix, began. To be honest with you, we are not at all happy with your presence in our town. Not only are we not happy, we're negative and suspicious. During these days of Muharram, the blood of the young Shia is boiling because of the injustices caused the Prophet's family, and several times a day they cry, Har blamen harabokum. Therefore, we are annoyed and hurt by the fact that someone like you is on holiday enjoying yourself. Later it asked, in your presence, what sedition is planning to occur? The rest of the leaflet was a comprehensive charge sheet against Britain, the old colonial fox, and against me by extension. It explained why we will never have a good feeling about the presence and appearance of the English in our country. Part of the leaflet asserted my direct culpability as the British Foreign Secretary involved with the nuclear negotiations and the imposition of sanctions during the Ahmadinejad presidency. Part asserted my guilt by association for being British and therefore responsible for a long list of humiliations of Iran, from the 1857 Paris Treaty, the Reuters 1872 and the tobacco 1890 monopolies, the stealing and looting of Iran's oil 1901 onwards, our malign intervention in the 1906 Constitutional Revolution, our occupation of part of their country during and immediately after the Second World War, 1941 to 46, and through to the 1953 coup against the Prime Minister Mossadegh, our support for the Shah, our arms to Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, and our support for terrorist groups against the Islamic Republic. Yeah, so as you can see, there's a long list of crimes they are prescribing to Britain. Just to quickly run down some of these, because it's interesting what the sort of the implication here. So obviously, the 1857 Paris Treaty refers to the end of the Second Anglo-Persian War, where Iran formally swore off any further claim to Herat in Western Afghanistan. The Reuters and tobacco 1890 monopolies are a reference to the two different concessions that Britain tried to negotiate with Iran. The Reuters in 1872 was basically over the right of Baron Julius de Ruyter, a powerful communications and media baron, to basically have the unique right to exploit all mines and resources of Iran. And the other one, the 1890 one, was about Britain had the sole right to produce and trade all tobacco products within Iran. Both of these were seen as humiliations, but both of them ultimately failed. Obviously, the stealing and looting of Iran's oil, so the Darcy concession was granted in 1901, and obviously there's a long story behind that, which I won't get into. The malign intervention in the 1906 Constitutional Revolution is interesting because, on the one hand, you could sort of see the Iranian regime being somewhat downstream, and the 1979 revolution in particular being somewhat downstream of the 1906 Constitutional Revolution, because again, that's where the concept of mashruter or guidance comes from, and that revolution did have clerical support. I think what they're alluding to is the fact that some of the protesters of that revolution took refuge or bast sanctuary in the British embassy. And so there's this idea that Britain helped support and cause the constitutional revolution. So this could. So are they annoyed that just because we had our hand in something, even though it may not have necessarily been malign, or is it just perhaps the members of the regime don't look fondly on the constitutional revolution? I'll need to look more into that. Obviously, the occupation during the Second World War is understandable. In my opinion, I don't really see that was really in our national interest. I think that was more help to the Soviets more than anything. The 1953 coup, again, that was largely there to shore up our oil industry because Mossadegh had nationalized in the Anglo-Iranian oil company. Obviously, arms to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, wasn't appreciated. And now terrorist groups against the Islamic Republic, I'm not really sure what he's alluding to there. And wrong to hell, they didn't end up with a national bank in the end. Well, they did, but the thing is, that was the second Reuters concession. The national bank was owned by Reuter and British financiers. So it was imagine you have a national bank, but it's controlled by foreign Jewish financiers. So imagine how well that turned out. The indictment concludes by asserting that I had supported the heads of the sedition behind the 2009 Green Movement in the disturbances which followed the disputed 2009 election, which were brutally repressed by the IRGC in the Basij. The leaflet was signed by 17 groups, including the students of Yazd Basij. Useful confirmation of who was behind the campaign to ensure that ours was a holiday to remember. So the Green Movement, for those who don't know, in 2009, there was a presidential election where Ahmadinejad won a surprise re-election victory, and many people in Iran protested that election result, believing the system had rigged it. And so there was a lot of protests, and the IRGC cracked down on it. There's a couple of different interpretations I've seen of that event. Some see it as you can see it a bit like the 2020 US election, where people thought there was malarkey going on with that election and contesting the results, and the J6 protesters facing persecution for that. That's one element. Another comparison that's interesting is the idea that there was genuine concerns that it was some kind of foreign-backed colour revolution. I mean, what we would see with the Arab Spring a couple of years later, that certainly was the case when it came to Egypt. So, perhaps the Iranians were right to be concerned about that. I mean, in fact, it's called the Green Movement. Hello, it literally screams colour revolution. Once I moved away from the black-clad group, an Iranian tourist said to me in good English how sorry he was that these Basij men had been disrupting our enjoyment. He commented that they did not like President Rouhani or Foreign Minister Zarif, and spat out Basij as though it was the most profane word in the Persian lexicon. Basij they were. There was no way they could have known almost exactly where I would arrive, least of all with good enough time to produce such a document unless they'd been given a lot of advance information. Perhaps the visa office tipped them off. Mohammad Javad Zarif had been appointed as foreign minister following President Rouhani's election on the reformist platform in June 2013. Zarif is the most accomplished of Iran's career diplomats. With a PhD from a US university, he is completely fluent in English. He served as Iran's ambassador to the United Nations from 2002 to 2007 and was the principal negotiator for Iran from 2013 to 2015, leading to the successful nuclear deal with the US and other world powers, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. The encounter with the black-clad young men by the cypress tree was only the start of a determined campaign by the Basij and their allies to make our trip as little like a holiday as possible, and much more like a forced conscription into a thriller. It was a campaign that would see one part of the Iranian state, along with its police force, trying to protect us, pitted against another part of the same state, backed by its security apparatus. It was a further 5 hours by road from the cypress tree to Shiraz. On the way, we were able to visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae. Later, Mohammed made a routine call to the Hotel Homer, the downtown Shiraz hotel where we were due to stay, to let them know that we were on our way. All was fine. Soon afterwards, Mohammed was called back by the hotel to say that there was a group of 5 men waiting in the lobby for my arrival. They were evidently colleagues of the Basij group we'd encountered at the cypress tree, as it would have been impossible for the cypress group, even driving madly as only Iranians can, to have compressed the trip into 2 hours. Mohammed told the hotel to call the local police. The police then phoned Mohammed and told him to have us drive around the ring road whilst they sorted out a safe passage through the hotel's rear entrance. In a few minutes, the plan was off too. There were, the police told Mohammed, 100 demonstrators at the front of the hotel and 20 at the rear, would have to carry on round and round the ring road. After another half hour, Mohammed stopped the vehicle and disappeared into a mobile phone kiosk, returning with 2 new phones. He started working both. He beckoned Dan and me out onto the pavement. He couldn't speak in front of our driver, he explained. He might be on the wrong side. It was the police who had told him to change his phones. They were sure that Mohammed had been intercepted by the IRGC, and they thought that our vehicle had also been bugged. We should give no detail to our wives in the car, as the driver understood more English than he let on. Anxiety levels were rising in the people carrier. There's only one thing for it, said Dan, chuckling. Jane Austen. Jane Austen what? Came up a reply. I've got Lindsay Duncan reading Pride and Prejudice on my iPad. That will take our minds off whatever's going on. The plan now was that we would switch hotel. Whilst that was being arranged, it was back along the ring road, diverted by Mr. Bennett and Elizabeth. It was after another 20 minutes and more animated phone calls that Mohammed shouted to the driver to cut across the central reservation and stop behind the unmarked white car. We were due to spend 3 nights in Shiraz to include a visit on our final day to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Police said that we couldn't visit Persepolis when it was open to the public, and the following day it, like all other public monuments, would be closed for Ashura itself. But that's fine, the senior official told us. I have arranged for it to be open just for you and your party, but on one condition. None of you goes too close to the perimeter of the site where you could be spotted by picnickers in the adjacent public park. Persepolis, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, covers a vast area. At the height of the Achaemenid Empire, it not only contained all the imperial buildings, but housed a small city as well. We had it to ourselves. It was an astonishing privilege, a mark of the efforts being made by one part of the Iranian state to compensate for the disruption of our trip by another. Late that afternoon, Dan and I went for a swim in the hotel's pool. It was a men-only session, and two of the senior officials were in the pool with us. I thanked them for all their help. One of them replied that this had been given because I had so long supported the Barjam, as the JCPOA nuclear deal is known in Persian. Most Iranians viewed me in a very friendly way, but some did not and saw me as a representative of the English with malign intent. I'd indeed long supported the Barjam, along with my French and German foreign minister colleagues. We three had started the nuclear negotiations with Iran in 2003 and had come frustratingly close to a deal in 2005. I've had another question in the chat. Garrett Fritcher. Do you see any parallel between the Arab Spring in Egypt and the Iranian Revolution? From what I'm aware of, Egypt is an Islamist lot, came into the government in Egypt, though they were putsch later. Well, I see the downfall of Mubarak as being a covert revolution. All that happened in the chaos is, the Muslim Brotherhood took over, but then later they were putsch by other forces. I'd have to look more into the Arab Spring in Egypt because, the Iranian Revolution was very broad. It had the support from the Bazaris, from students, from intellectuals, from professionals, from the mullahs. In Egypt, I'd have to see if there was wider support, but I suspect not because that had gay ops and colour revolution all over it. Right. Okay. Early on our last day in Shiraz, we went to pay homage to the great 14th century Iranian poet Hafez at his shrine in the Mustala Gardens, opened specifically for us. Hafez was the son of Shiraz, rarely leaving the city. The Iranians are mad about poetry. It's something never to forget when negotiating with them. Their love of words, their poetic appreciation of ambiguity. It was a golden morning with the birds chittering and early autumn scents in the air, the best of Iran. It was late by the time we arrived at our next stop, Isfahan, because we had been told by the police that we had to arrive after dark. We were staying at the Abbasi Hotel, which must have been one of the most beautiful in the world. Its core is a 300-year-old caravanserai, a lodging house for travellers, on a spectacular scale with an astonishing Persian garden at its heart. There was a plainclothes policeman waiting for us in the lobby. All was quiet overnight. Isfahan had been the capital of Iran on two occasions, in the Seljuk period around the 11th century, and then during the Safavid era of 1501 to 1736. It is the Seljuks and Safavids who had left their mark on the city, with the blue-tiled Jameh Mosque, the Nashk-i-Jahan Square, reputed to be one of the largest city squares in the world, and the 33-arch Alaverdi Khan Bridge. In the morning, it was off to visit the sites. The mosques were heavenly with a sublime atmosphere, a stark contrast to what was to follow. We were trailed the whole time by a young man. We were never quite sure whose side he was on, badges or that part of the police that was on our side. Lunch was in a very old restaurant which had water channels between the tables. These required very careful navigation, too careful for Julia, who managed to trip into one of them though without damage to herself. Having eaten, we were waiting for a signal from Mohammed to leave, but he was first on one phone, then on the other. After about an hour, he came over and told us mournfully that about 100 Basij were holding a demonstration outside our hotel. The police sent us to an empty, anonymous hotel about 12 miles away in an industrial park in Shahin Shah to wait developments. 2 hours went past. There was no news at all about what might happen next. We were all outraged that we were being sequestered in this soulless place, deprived of time to enjoy exquisite Isfahan. Alice and Julia had had enough. This was not a holiday they had signed up for, nor did they find especially tolerable the boys' own attitude of their spouses that this was an interesting adventure, that we were sure would come to no physical harm, and on no account should we allow ourselves to be seen off by the Basij. Our new charge in the just reopened British Embassy in Tehran, Ben Fender, knew of our trip, but up to this point, I had seen no point in bothering him with our local difficulties, hoping that the diversions in Shiraz would be the beginning and end of them. It was, however, now plain that the Basij would be at us wherever we went. I called Ben for advice, though knowing before he told me that what he could do, talk to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, would make little difference, since like the local police, they were on our side anyway. Problem was with other parts of the Iranian state over which the MFA had no effective influence. Oh, I didn't know Russians had a love of poetry. That's new to me. I know they had a lot of novelists, but poetry, that I didn't know that. After 2 more hours in limbo, we got word that the demonstration had been cleared and it was safe to return to the Abbasi Hotel. We dropped in there briefly and then went off to the Shahzad restaurant, where we received a warm welcome from the distinguished elderly gentleman who ran it. He insisted on wearing a tie, an unusual sight in Iran, where the absence of a tie has long been regarded as one of the essential mark of being a good male citizen of the Islamic Republic. On Monday, the 26th of October, we checked out of the Abbasi early to visit the Blue Mosque and two others, equally exquisite, and then to have breakfast at the Khalsar Hotel across the city where we were told we could eat in peace. A professional football team were also having breakfast, more selfies. But peace was not on the menu. We got word that the Basij had found out where we were and were organising yet another demonstration for my benefit. It was only a small group, but on the way out, as we were bundled into our people carrier and were driving off, one man, puce in the face, began shouting and then threw a large tomato at the van. We were given a plainclothes escort and were later told that two cars of Basij had been turned around by the police. A visit to Kashan, an ancient city halfway between Isfahan and Tehran, had been scheduled, but we were now warned off that too. I agreed with the rest of the party that we'd have to cut our losses and truncate our holiday. We weren't due to leave until Saturday, but we'd thankfully booked fully flexible tickets. Back in Tehran on the Monday evening, we took our dinner in our hotel. Across the restaurant was a middle-ranking government minister with his family. He came over to greet us in good English. He knew exactly what had happened to us at the hands of the Basij without us saying a word about it. He was sympathetic but brushed out our experience off with a chuckle, as though this was one of those hazards in a tourist trip that could happen to anyone. It was another reminder that those nominally in charge of the government of Iran had no control whatever over its security apparatus, nor a sense of responsibility for the consequences of its actions, or in this case, its failure to act. So again, as you can see, there's this real tension where, despite normally being the foreign minister or being in a government department, you have no influence over these parallel Islamic institutions, whether it's the Basij, the IRGC, or the any sort of arms of that part of the state. It's really incredible, isn't it? I can't think of any other government in history that's acted in that way. When my daughter Charlotte read this account, she asked, "What is it about Iran and your relationship with it that meant you were so desperate to pretend to yourself and your dear wife and friends that everything was fine and would just go away? I really wanted our problems to go away. My experience with the country suggested that they often did. On this occasion, however, I was wrong." Then I visited Turkish Airlines and changed our return flights to Wednesday, the 28th of October. That evening, we had a relaxed dinner inside the British Embassy compound with Ben Fender and his newly arrived and very small team. I'd last been inside the compound on a British parliamentary visit in January 2014. At that stage, little of the damage caused by the Basij and associated thugs when they had invaded the embassy 2 years before had been repaired. Now the perimeter was secure, with razor wire everywhere, and the main residence was serviceable. After the embassy dinner, we were driven straight into the basement car park of our hotel to avoid any Basij who might be hanging around in the lobby. The others took the lift direct to our rooms on the 13th floor, but I needed to go on the front desk to retrieve our passports. As Mohammed and I got into the lift in the lobby, a large sinister-looking man dressed all in black squeezed in just as the doors were closing. When asked which floor, he signalled that he wanted the same one as us, all while speaking on one phone and texting to another. Basij, he trailed us around the corridor. Mohammed called the hotel security and then spent the whole night outside our rooms in case this man, plus compatriots, decided to return. It was yet another reminder of the astonishing decency and sense of duty of most Iranians. The plan was that on the way to the airport we would visit Ayatollah Khomeini's shrine, but on police advice this was cancelled too. As our plane finally left Iranian airspace, the four of us ordered large alcoholic drinks, our first for 11 days, and celebrated, if that's the word, our safe departure. I had one inquiry from a UK newspaper asking whether it was correct that we were having to stay overnight in a safe house outside of Isfahan because of demonstrations. I was able to answer accurately, if economically, that although there had been a demonstration outside our hotel, that had been dispersed and we were staying there as planned. The last thing that any of us wanted was to give the Basij the satisfaction of international publicity. We were always clear that we were simply the means by which the Basij could attack their real target, the Rouhani government, and its wish to open Iran up to the outside world. The hardliners did not like me, for sure, but they hated the reformers for what they might do to rein in the militia's unaccountable power. The demonstrations against our trip did receive some limited publicity within Iran. Our website carried a large colour photograph showing demonstrators holding placards with complaints against me in both Persian and English. The Persian text told the reader, "The city of martyrs is not the place to cater for the English enemy." Thanks to the vagaries of Google Translates, the English version carried the immortal lines, "City martyr catering, English is not the enemy." Yeah, that's why what you get for relying on Google Translate, or perhaps Grok nowadays. Okay, right, we're going for nearly an hour. Yeah, what I'm going to do is there's another very short chapter I just want to read from where he goes over a bit more history and about some of the grievances the Iranians have. So, chapter 2, it's always an English job. And he's got a couple of quotes. Kar kare İngilizce hast. That's Persian for the job is always an English one. Ubiquitous saying in common use in Iran. So yes, that's the namesake of the title of the book and of this stream. There's this sense in Iran where they're all kind of a little bit conspiratarded, where they think Britain is behind all their misfortune. You know, and that's true somewhat historically, but even today, you know, the 79 revolution was Britain. You know, the Green Revolution or Green Protest was Britain. We're behind the mullahs. People in Iran, if they, oh, Britain, can't you come in and get rid of the mullahs for us, please? It's really funny. And the other quote is, it is a huge mistake to trust evil Britain. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran, televised address 3rd of June 2016. The Badges demonstrators protesting against my presence in Iran were not alone in describing the English as the enemy. High suspicion of the British is ingrained in Iranian society, and for good reason. This distrust springs from the malign experiences that Iran suffered at Britain's hands during almost all of the 19th century and much of the 20th. There's an old joke amongst the British diplomats that Iran is the only country in the world that still thinks the UK is a superpower. To Iranians, it's not a joke. Yeah, the Iranians believe in the my friend Semigog's the GAAE, or the global Anglo-American Empire. Or the same view as someone like a Tom Luongo, the gays secretly run from London. I wonder if he's spoken to some Iranians. That's where he's got the idea from. It's routine for conservative elements in the regime to blame outsiders, usually the British, when faced with protests against the restrictions of the Islamic Republic or other manifestations of discontent. Thus, in their eyes, foreign agents, including the UK, were primarily responsible for the serious street protests that occurred in Iran in December 2017 and January 2018. When in February 2016, elections to the Iranian parliament produced the wrong answer, with a victory for allies of reformist President Rouhani, the then Chief Justice of Iran, Ayatollah Sadiq Larijani, interestingly, the fellow who has just allegedly been assassinated by Israel. The Iranians haven't confirmed his death yet, but we'll see. Complained that the moderates had formed a British list of successful candidates and had worked with American and English media outlets during the campaign. Whether someone as worldly as Ayatollah Larijani, he comes from one of the most powerful families in Iran and has fluent English, really believes the fantastic idea that in 2016, British agents could have manufactured voter discontent in Iran amongst an electorate otherwise sublimely content with their lot is impossible to say. What is certainly true is that the notion that we are some unseen, all-pervasive influence on life and events in Iran is very deep-seated. It's not just a convenient alibi for the in fact unaccountable conservative elements amongst the Iranian elite, but truism amongst much of Iranian society. I'm reminded of this yet again at a meeting in London in late 2019. An exiled Iranian woman who was a strong opponent of the Islamic Republic nonetheless declared in categorical terms that she knew that the British continued to be behind most things in Iran that went wrong. This neurosis about the British extended to the last Shah. As we will see, in 1953, the UK and US were planning a coup d'etat against the incumbent elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The Shah was to be the beneficiary of this coup. It would enable him to rule untrammeled by the will of the people. He was, however, so intensely neurotic that he was being set up by the hidden hand of the British that the most extraordinary measures had to be taken to reassure him. Yes, that again alluding to the idea that he thought that we were actually going to turn on him and side with Mossadegh. A few years ago, whilst President Ahmadinejad was in office, a Persian-speaking British academic flagged down a taxi at Tehran airport. On the way into the city, the cab driver confided in his passenger, "We all know that it was Margaret Thatcher who removed the Shah and put the Ayatollahs in power," but he added, now we're really cheesed off with the mullahs, so would you ask the British Prime Minister, Mr. Brown, to get rid of them?" Well, technically it wasn't Thatcher because the revolution was February 79 and Thatcher didn't enter government until May 79, so technically it would have been James Callaghan, if anyone. No, this isn't I'm referring to Tom Luongo, who was a chap who believes that Britain runs the global American empire, or the global Anglo-American empire, if you want to use that term. The notion of blaming the British, almost always described as the English by Iranians, and endowing them with superhuman powers, brilliantly satirized by Iraj Pereshkad in his novel, later popular television series, My Uncle Napoleon. It's the story of a pathetic and pathological man who, depressed by his failures, turns himself into Napoleon in his fantasies and becomes convinced of a British plot to destroy him. As the book explains, there was no such plot. Uncle Napoleon was a small fry, but the novel was set in the early 1940s. Britain and the Soviet Union had invaded Iran in 1941 and jointly occupied it until 1946. It was we, the occupying powers, who effectively ran the country in this period and locked up a number of prominent figures on suspicious of their pro-Nazi sympathies. So Uncle Napoleon's paranoia was not entirely misplaced. Few Londoners would be able to say where the German, French, or even US embassies are situated. Everyone in Tehran knows where the British embassy is. The main compound is a downtown Tehran, occupies a large 12-acre site, and there's another residential compound, Gul Haq Garden, 4 times bigger and less polluted, northern Tehran. These compounds are seen as potent symbols of the disproportionate power that many Iranians feel the British exercised over their country for nearly 2 centuries, right up to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and our alleged continuing efforts to subvert the Iranian nation. Colloquial sayings in everyday use emphasize this. Poshte pade hamishe yek Inglis hast. Behind the curtain is always an Englishman, goes one. Inglise haba pabe sa miboran. The English cut heads with cotton, runs a second, a backhanded compliment to our diplomatic skills. And most ubiquitous of all, car care Inglise hast. The job is always an English job, hence the title of this book. As I explained in my introduction, the principal aim of this book is to try and provide readers with a better understanding of this country and of Britain's role in it, but that understanding also requires an appreciation of these 3 aspects of the singular nature of modern Iran. The first is the complex ethnic composition of Iran. True Persian speakers make up less than 2/3 of the population. Nearly 1/6 are Azeris, who have a Turkic mother tongue. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is one. Kurds in the northwest are a 10th. There are then Arab minorities in the west and southwest, and Baluchs near the Pakistan border. 90% of the population is Shia, around 8% are Sunni, and remainder Christians, Baha'is, Jews, and Zoroastrians. The second aspect is the antiquity of Iran's civilization, which informs its profound and secular sense of Iranian nationalism. The third and most important element is the fundamental role that Shiism has played and continues to play in the underpinning Iranian identity and politics. Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has argued that Iran has to decide whether it is a nation or a cause. That is a great expression. It's a curious observation for such a distinguished American statesman to make, since the United States itself only became the immensely powerful nation it is today because of the ideals, the cause that the founding fathers set out, which are now so embedded in the American sense of self-belief. For Iran, disentangling cause and nation is a well-nigh hopeless task. I argue in my concluding chapters that if Iran wants the international respect it craves and deserves, it has to follow agreed international norms of behaviour. But an understanding of Iran today requires an appreciation of the very strong cultural and ideological forces, the causes that have moulded its history and its people today. Even as most Iranians become more secular in their daily lives, this remains the case. It's not just another country, it's Iran. My story begins with one of Iran's most powerful leaders, Cyrus the Great. And then in the next chapter, the next several chapters, he just kind of gives like a brief summary of Iranian history. So there's a chapter, the next one is on ancient Iran before the Islamic conquest. The next one after that, he sort of looks at the beginning of modern Iranian history of Shah Ismail. And then later on, he kind of delves more into the British relationship during the 19th century, during the 20th century, and then the contemporary relationship since the creation of the Islamic Republic. So we're going about an hour and my voice is starting to go, so I think I'll end the stream now. I hope this has been interesting for everyone. If people really like this, maybe in like a week or so, I might come back and do some more reading from this book because it is quite good. I'll probably skip over a lot of the history chapters and maybe go straight to the meat of I might go over the chapter where Straw makes his first official visit to Iran and the whole nuclear negotiations, because of course that's during the Bush era, and that some really interesting stuff goes on. Let me see if I've had any other questions in the chat or any other interesting comments. Wrong tail Wu. To be fair to Iranians, I think Britain has more sway in the Gulf than elsewhere, like say Syria or the Philippines. Have to look more into that wrong tail Wu because we formally withdrew from the Gulf states in 1971, and I think America has kind of replaced us there. Okay. Mainly via the Gulf monarchies in defense of money laundering, Iranians themselves also deposit quite a lot in Britain than compared with, say, Japan or Mexico. Yeah, I've heard claims that the British still run Iran's oil industry, though I'm skeptical. I'd have to look more into that. I find it very surprising if Iran still lets Britain have that much sway over a critical resource. I mean, I can see us having a stake in the Gulf monarchies, oil and gas, but Iran certainly not. Garrett Fritcher. I'll say that Britain holds more sway in the Emirdoms than elsewhere indeed. Funny that Britain has held fast there, but hardly so elsewhere. Well, again, we withdrew from the Gulf in 1971, so if people are interested, I have done a couple of streams looking at the British withdrawal from the Arabian Peninsula on Iron Duke's channel. We did one on the retreat from Aden in the 1960s, and then another one on our relationship with Oman and our support of the coup that brought in. There was a coup around that time, 1970, where we got rid of the Sultan and brought a new Sultan in. You'll see the withdrawal point, but that's to play devil's advocate, and you have the Pakistani situation where Britain certainly does have quite a lot of influence. Well, I wouldn't say we have that much influence, considering the amount of cucking our government does to Pakistan, getting rid of their excess population. So I'm going to push back on that. Time to go over Super Chat. So Wrong Tail Wu for $10. Speaking of which, do you think the more internationalist cause side is more powerful or the nationalist element? I've got the feeling after Soleimani, it's the internationalist. It's difficult because there's two sides of the regime. I would say that the reformist side of Iran was strengthening in the years leading up to this conflict that's just broken out, especially as the current president, Pezeshkian, is a reformist. However, this whole conflict with Israel and America and the assassination of the supreme leader, I think this has completely flipped things back in the hardliners' favor again. So, I think ultimately, if your goal is to try and normalize Iran and make it a normal country that's not an international pariah, treating it this way is no way to encourage it to moderate its behavior so we can successfully accomplish that. Okay. And have we had any super chats on entropy? Okay, we've had no super chats on entropy. What I will say though is I do recall Wrong Tao, I think, sent a super thanks on one of my streams the other day. I'm just going to quickly look that up and read it. One moment. Sorry, I'm still just trying to find it. Okay, I found it. Wrongtail Wu sent a $10 super thanks on my Cairo and Khartoum on the Arab question, 1915 to 18. So that was one of the readings I believe I did for the Chat House series. This is for the videos I missed lately and to say how amazing this episode was. Well, thank you very much, Wrongtail Wu. It's always appreciated, your super chats and super thanks. Interesting, got this Andy chat guy in the chat. As far as I know, we've not sent anyone to the Gulf. As far as I know, we're staying clear of this war. Okay, maybe we're just defending their airspace and not deploying to the Gulf proper, like the actual sea bit. And Wrongtail's just sending a member message. My pleasure. Well, yeah, it was always appreciated, Wrongtail. You are my strongest super chatter, alongside a distant night. Well, thank you all for watching, and as I said, may go back to this book and do more reading in future, because it's certainly an interesting deep dive in answering this question of Anglo-Iranian relations and the attempted normalization. So good night, everybody. Thanks for watching.